The monster Ayatollah Khamenei, Untold Crimes of Iran's Supreme Leader, a 40-year nightmare. The air raid sirens began wailing across Tehran at 2:47 a.m. on March 1, 2026. Most residents initially thought it was another drill. The Iranian government had been conducting them weekly since tensions with Israel had escalated in recent months. But this time, the sirens were real. And the target was not some military installation or nuclear facility buried deep underground. The target was a man. At exactly 2:51 a.m., precision-guided missiles fired from stealth aircraft struck a heavily fortified compound in northern Tehran. The building, officially listed as a government administrative center, but known to intelligence agencies as one of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's personal residences, was reduced to rubble in seconds. Secondary explosions suggested that the compound had been storing weapons or ammunition, turning the structure into its own funeral pyre. By 3:15 a.m., Iranian state media was in chaos. By 4:30 a.m., they confirmed what the world already suspected. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Supreme Leader of Iran for 37 years, architect of some of the most brutal state-sponsored violence in modern history, and the man responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of his own people, was dead. Some called it an assassination. Others called it an act of war. But for the millions of Iranians whose lives had been destroyed by Khamenei's regime, the mothers who never saw their children again after they joined protests, the fathers tortured in basement cells until they confessed to crimes they didn't commit, the families who watched their loved ones hang from construction cranes in public squares, there was only one word for what happened in Tehran that night: justice. But justice came 40 years too late. Because Ali Khamenei was not just a political leader. He was not just an authoritarian dictator. He was something far more sinister. A mass murderer who operated with the legitimacy of a government. A serial killer who signed death warrants instead of wielding a knife. A criminal mastermind who built an empire of terror disguised as religious authority. This is not the story of a supreme leader's death. This is the story of a monster's reign, and the 40-year nightmare that finally ended with fire falling from the sky. Ali Hosseini Khamenei was born on April 19, 1939, in Mashhad, a city in northeastern Iran famous for its religious significance as the burial place of Imam Reza, the eighth Imam of Shia Islam. His father was a modest cleric, his family poor but deeply religious. From childhood, Khamenei was consumed by two passions: religious study and political grievance. He attended seminaries, studying Islamic jurisprudence, philosophy, and theology. But unlike many religious scholars who focus purely on spiritual matters, Khamenei was fascinated by power, who had it, how they maintained it, and how it could be taken from them. In the 1960s and 1970s, as Iran was ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a monarch who had been installed with American and British support and who ruled with increasing authoritarianism, Khamenei became involved in opposition movements. He was arrested multiple times by the Shah's feared secret police, Savak, and was reportedly tortured during one interrogation, an experience that left him with permanent damage to his right arm. These experiences radicalized him, but not in the way one might expect. Khamenei didn't emerge from torture determined to build a more just society. He emerged determined to become the torturer instead of the tortured. He learned that power, unchecked and absolute, was the only thing that mattered. When the Iranian Revolution erupted in 1979, overthrowing the Shah and bringing Ayatollah Khamenei to power as supreme leader, Khamenei positioned himself as one of Khomeiни's most loyal disciples. He was rewarded with increasingly powerful positions: Friday prayer leader in Tehran, representative to the Revolutionary Guards, and eventually, president of Iran in 1981. But Khamenei was never satisfied with being second. He wanted the throne. And in 1989, when Ayatollah Khamenei died, Ali Khamenei, through political maneuvering, backroom deals, and the support of the Revolutionary Guards, was appointed supreme leader despite not having the religious credentials traditionally required for the position. He was 50 years old, and for the next 37 years, he would transform Iran into his personal torture chamber. Understanding Khamenei's crimes requires understanding the system he controlled. As supreme leader, Khamenei was not just the political head of Iran. He was the ultimate authority over every institution in the country. The military answered to him. The judiciary answered to him. The police answered to him. The Revolutionary Guards answered to him. Even elected officials, including the president, could only operate within boundaries Khamenei set. This was not democracy. This was not even typical dictatorship. This was theocratic totalitarianism with one man at its apex. Khamenei controlled the Revolutionary Guards, IRGC, a military and paramilitary force parallel to Iran's regular military, with its own army, navy, air force, and intelligence services. The IRGC operated both inside Iran, suppressing dissent, and abroad, funding proxy groups, conducting assassinations, orchestrating terrorism. The Basij, a volunteer paramilitary organization that functioned as Khamenei's street enforcers. The Basij were the ones who beat protesters with batons, who arrested young women for not wearing hijabs properly, who patrolled neighborhoods looking for UN Islamic behavior. The judiciary, every judge in Iran was ultimately appointed by or accountable to Khamenei. The courts were not about justice, they were about control. Trials were predetermined. Confessions were extracted through torture. Sentences were designed to terrorize. Evin Prison, located in northwestern Tehran. Evin was Khamenei's crown jewel of terror, a facility where thousands of political prisoners were held, tortured, and executed. We will return to Evin later, because it is where some of Khamenei's most heinous crimes occurred. But perhaps Khamenei's most powerful weapon was his control over religious authority. As supreme leader, he could issue fatwas, religious rulings, that gave his political decisions the weight of divine command. When he wanted to execute dissidents, he declared them enemies of God. When he wanted to suppress women's rights, he claimed it was Islamic law. When he wanted to fund terrorist groups abroad, he called it defending Islam. Religion became his weapon, and millions of Iranians, devout Muslims who had supported the revolution, found themselves trapped in a theocracy that bore no resemblance to the just society they had been promised. If there is one event that defines Ali Khamenei's criminality, one moment that reveals the depths of his capacity for evil, it is the summer of 1988. The year 1988 marked the end of the Iran-Iraq War, a brutal 8-year conflict that had killed hundreds of thousands on both sides. As the war wound down and Iran accepted a ceasefire, the regime faced a problem: what to do with the thousands of political prisoners being held in Iranian jails. These prisoners were not soldiers. Most were not even violent criminals. They were dissidents, members of opposition groups like the People's Mujahideen of Iran, MEK, leftists, communists, ethnic minorities, and anyone who had dared to criticize the regime. Many had been imprisoned for years, some for nothing more than distributing leaflets or attending protests. Ayatollah Khamenei, still supreme leader at the time, issued a fatwa ordering the execution of political prisoners who were deemed enemies of God. But it was Ali Khamenei, then serving as president and positioning himself to become the next supreme leader, who helped implement what would become known as the 1988 Iranian Massacre, one of the worst mass executions in modern history. Throughout the summer and fall of 1988, secret death commissions were established in prisons across Iran. These were not trials. They were processing centers for murder. Here's how the system worked. Prisoners were brought before 3-man panels consisting of a prosecutor, a judge, and a religious official. The sessions lasted minutes, sometimes less than a minute. Prisoners were asked a handful of questions designed to determine their loyalty to the regime. Do you believe in God? Do you accept the Islamic Republic? Are you willing to denounce your political affiliations? Will you walk through a minefield for the Imam? If prisoners answered incorrectly, if they refused to betray their beliefs, if they maintained their political positions, if they showed even the slightest defiance, they were immediately sentenced to death. No appeals, no lawyers, no due process. They were taken directly from the commission room to the execution chamber. Many were hanged in groups. Some were lined up against walls and shot. Their bodies were buried in unmarked mass graves, often without their families being notified. Estimating the exact death toll from the 1988 massacre is difficult because the Iranian government has never released official records, has never acknowledged the full extent of what happened, and has actively covered up evidence for nearly 4 decades. But based on testimony from survivors, information smuggled out of Iran, satellite imagery of mass graves, and investigations by human rights organizations, experts estimate that between 5,000 and 30,000 political prisoners were executed during the summer and fall of 1988. 30,000 people, killed in secret, buried in unmarked graves. Their families told nothing about what happened to them. Among the dead, women and men as young as 15. Pregnant women, executed after giving birth. Elderly prisoners who had already served their sentences but were executed anyway. Prisoners who had been sentenced to short terms for minor offenses but were executed because they refused to renounce their beliefs. One survivor, who was 17 years old at the time and spent months in Evin Prison during the massacre, later testified, "Every morning, we would wake up to silence. And we knew what the silence meant. It meant they had come during the night and taken more prisoners to be hanged. Sometimes we could hear the sounds through the walls, the footsteps, the crying, the prayers, and then silence. Always silence." Ali Khamenei has always denied direct involvement in the 1988 massacre, claiming he was merely following Ayatollah Khamenei's orders as president. But evidence suggests otherwise. According to testimony from former officials and leaked documents, Khamenei was not a passive observer. He was an active participant. He attended meetings where the executions were planned. He approved lists of prisoners to be executed. He ensured that the Revolutionary Guards carried out the killings efficiently and quietly. And perhaps most damningly, when he became supreme leader in 1989, just months after the massacre, he immediately took steps to cover it up. He ordered the destruction of documents related to the executions. He silenced survivors who tried to speak out. He ensured that none of the officials who had served on the death commissions were ever prosecuted. In fact, many of those officials were promoted. Some went on to hold powerful positions in Khamenei's government, including in the judiciary and the Revolutionary Guards. The message was clear: loyalty to Khamenei meant never having to answer for your crimes. The 1988 massacre was not just mass murder. It was a test, Khamenei's way of determining who in the Iranian power structure was willing to follow orders no matter how monstrous. Those who passed the test were rewarded. Those who showed hesitation disappeared. If the 1988 massacre was Khamenei's greatest single crime, then Evin Prison was a crime scene that defined his entire reign. Located in the Evin neighborhood of northwestern Tehran, at the foot of the Alborz Mountains, Evin Prison was originally built in 1972 during the Shah's era to hold political prisoners. It owned a dark reputation then, but under the Islamic Republic, under Khomeini, and especially under Khamenei, it became something far worse. Evin became synonymous with torture, rape, forced confessions, disappearances, and death. For 4 decades, if you were arrested for political reasons in Iran, there was a high probability you would end up in Evin. And if you ended up in Evin, there was a high probability you would be tortured. The torture methods used in Evin Prison, all sanctioned by Khamenei's judiciary and security apparatus, included physical torture, beatings with cables, batons, and fists, often on the soles of feet, a technique called phalanga, electric shocks applied to sensitive areas of the body, suspension from the ceiling by wrists or ankles for hours or days, sleep deprivation for extended periods, sometimes weeks, forced stress positions that caused permanent physical damage, burns from cigarettes and other implements, breaking of bones systematically, fingers, hands, arms. Psychological torture, mock executions where prisoners were blindfolded and told they were about to be killed, forced to listen to the screams of other prisoners being tortured, threats against family members, including threats to arrest and torture spouses, children, and parents, solitary confinement in cells too small to stand or lie down in, sometimes for months or years, sexual violence, rape and sexual assault of both male and female prisoners, forced virginity tests and invasive physical examinations designed to humiliate, threats of rape against family members, rape of prisoners before execution, based on the twisted religious logic that virgins go to paradise, so raping female prisoners before killing them would condemn them to hell. This last practice, the rape of female political prisoners before execution, is one of the most horrifying aspects of Khamenei's prison system. Multiple survivors and former guards testified that it occurred one of Iran's most famous human rights 1990s, who was with the explicit approval of religious political prison regime, described the facility in an interview after her release. Evin is not a prison. It is a factory of broken human beings. You enter as a person and you leave, if you leave, as something else. A ghost. A shell. The regime doesn't just want to punish you. It wants to destroy who you are. Another survivor, who was imprisoned in Evin in 2009 during the Green Movement protests, testified. They want you to confess. They don't care if you're guilty. They want you to say you're guilty on camera, so they can show it on television and justify what they're doing. So they torture you until you'll say anything. I confess to being a spy for the CIA, for Israel, for Saudi Arabia. I confess to things I didn't even understand. After 5 days of beatings and electric shocks, I would have confessed to killing Kennedy if they asked me to. Perhaps most chillingly, a former interrogator who defected and fled Iran in 2015 admitted in an interview, "We knew most of the people we tortured were innocent." That wasn't the point. The point was fair. If people knew that anyone could be arrested, anyone could disappear, anyone could end up in Evin screaming in a basement cell, then they would be too afraid to challenge the supreme leader. Terror was the goal, not justice. Not everyone who entered Evin prison came out. Thousands of political prisoners simply disappeared. Their families would receive no notification of their arrest. They would be held incommunicado, no lawyers, no phone calls, no visits. And then, after weeks or months, their families might receive a phone call telling them to come collect their loved ones' belongings. No body, no explanation, no grave to visit. Many families spent years, sometimes decades, searching for information about what happened to their relatives. The regime refused to provide answers. Death certificates, if issued at all, would list vague causes of death, heart attack, suicide, natural causes. But the families knew the truth. Their loved ones had been murdered, and Ali Khamenei, as supreme leader with ultimate authority over the judiciary and security services, bore direct responsibility for every single disappearance. Unlike typical serial killers who commit their crimes in secret, Ali Khamenei operated in plain sight, but with the legitimacy of state power to shield him. He didn't strangle victims with his own hands. He signed documents that authorized others to do the killing. He didn't personally operate torture chambers. He appointed the judges and prison officials who did. He didn't pull the trigger at executions. He issued the religious rulings that declared executions permissible, even mandatory. But make no mistake, he was responsible for every death that occurred on his orders. Consider some of the victims. Sattar Beheshti, 2012, a 35-year-old blogger who wrote critically about the regime online. He was arrested, taken to a detention facility run by Iran cyber police, and tortured to death within days. His body showed signs of severe beatings. The authorities claimed he died of shock. No one was ever prosecuted for his murder. Nada Sultan, 2009, a 26-year-old philosophy student who was shot and killed by a Basij militiaman during the Green Movement protests. Her death was captured on video and became a symbol of the regime's brutality. Khamenei's government claimed she was killed by conspirators trying to make the regime look bad. The actual shooter was never arrested. Mahsa Amini, 2022, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman who was arrested by morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. She died in custody 3 days later. Official reports claimed she had a heart attack, but witnesses said she was beaten in the police van. Her death sparked nationwide protests that Khamenei's security forces brutally suppressed, killing over 500 people and arresting over 20,000. These are just 3 names among tens of thousands. Each represents a life destroyed by Khamenei's regime. Each represents a family torn apart. Each represents a future stolen. But Khamenei's crimes were not limited to murder and torture. He was also a thief on a spectacular scale. As supreme leader, Khamenei controlled vast economic enterprises through a shadowy network of foundations, trusts, and front companies, collectively estimated to be worth between $95 billion and $200 billion. Let that number sink in. Ali Khamenei, who officially received a modest salary as a religious leader and who presented himself as living a simple, pious life, controlled a financial empire worth up to $200 billion. Where did this money come from? From the Iranian people, through entities like Seted Idre Khamenei Hazratim, headquarters for executing the order of the Imam. Khamenei's office confiscated properties, businesses, and assets from Iranians, sometimes through legal manipulations, often through outright theft. The organization controlled assets ranging from real estate and construction companies to telecommunications firms and even an ostrich farm. Meanwhile, the average Iranian struggled with inflation, unemployment, and economic sanctions. People could barely afford food while Khamenei's foundations hoarded billions. He claimed to be a religious leader guiding his people toward righteousness. In reality, he was a crime boss running a protection racket disguised as a government. Throughout Khamenei's reign, the Iranian people rose up again and again to challenge his tyranny. Each time, he responded with violence. In 2009, after a widely disputed presidential election that gave Mahmoud Ahmadinejad a second term, many believed the election was rigged. Millions of Iranians took to the streets in what became known as the Green Movement. They were peaceful. They chanted slogans. They wore green ribbons and held signs. They demanded that their votes be counted fairly. Khamenei's response was predictable and brutal. He declared the protests to be a foreign-backed conspiracy and unleashed the Basij and Revolutionary Guards on the demonstrators. Protesters were beaten, shot, arrested, tortured, and killed. The exact death toll was never released, but human rights organizations estimate that at least 70 people were killed and over 4,000 arrested. Many of those arrested ended up in Evin Prison, where they were tortured until they confessed to being foreign agents. In November 2019, protests erupted across Iran after the government announced a dramatic increase in fuel prices. What started as economic protests quickly became political. Demonstrators called for the regime's overthrow and specifically called for Khamenei to step down. Khamenei's response was the deadliest crackdown in the history of the Islamic Republic. Security forces received orders to crush the protests without mercy. And they did. Protesters were shot in the head, chest, and vital organs, not with rubber bullets or tear gas, but with live ammunition designed to kill. According to Amnesty International and other human rights organizations, at least 1,500 people were killed over just a few days. Some estimates placed the death toll even higher. Thousands more were arrested and tortured. Internet service was shut down across the entire country for several days to prevent videos of the massacres from reaching the outside world. The death of Mahsa Amini, the November 2019 protest remained the largest and longest-lasting protest in the 21st century of the Islamic precisely Republic. Because Khamenei's regime controlled Iranians, the flow of information, led by women and girls who removed their hijabs and burned them in public squares, demonstrated across the country. They chanted woman, life, freedom, and death to the dictator, openly calling for Khamenei's overthrow. Khamenei's response followed the same playbook, brutal violence. But this time, the protesters fought back. They attacked police stations. They burned pictures of Khamenei. They toppled statues and defaced propaganda murals. Young women stood on cars in the middle of intersections, removed their hijabs, and waved them in the air like flags of liberation. The regime responded with mass arrests, torture, and executions. At least 537 protesters were killed, including dozens of children. Over 20,000 were arrested. Several were executed after sham trials, hanged in public to terrorize others into submission. But despite the violence, despite the arrests, despite the fear, the protests continued for months. Because the Iranian people had finally reached a breaking point. They were no longer willing to live in Khamenei's nightmare. Khamenei's crimes were not limited to Iran. As supreme leader, he oversaw a global network of terrorism, using Iranian resources to fund, train, and arm proxy groups across the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon. Khamenei provided billions of dollars in funding and weapons to Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group responsible for attacks on Israeli and Western targets, including the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing that killed 241 U.S. Marines. Hamas in Gaza. Iran, under Khamenei's direction, funded and armed Hamas, providing rockets, explosives expertise, and financial support used in attacks against Israeli civilians. Houthi rebels in Yemen. Khamenei backed the Houthis in Yemen's civil war, providing weapons and training that prolonged a conflict that has killed hundreds of thousands and created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Iraqi militias. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq attacked U.S. forces and targeted Iraqi civilians, destabilizing the country and contributing to ongoing violence. Assad, Syria. Khamenei sent Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces and Hezbollah fighters to support Bashar al-Assad's brutal regime in Syria, helping to perpetuate a civil war that has killed over 500,000 people and created millions of refugees. In every case, Khamenei justified these actions as resistance against Western imperialism and Zionism. But the reality was far simpler. He was exporting his model of repression, spreading violence, and building regional influence through proxies who answered to Tehran. Khamenei also operated a global assassination program targeting dissidents, journalists, and defectors who had fled Iran. Iranian agents assassinated activists in Turkey, Germany, France, and other countries. They bombed opposition offices. They kidnapped critics and brought them back to Iran to face execution. The message was clear. Even if you escaped Iran, Khamenei could still reach you. March 1st, 2026. Which brings us back to where we began. 2:51 a.m., March 1st, 2026, Tehran. The missiles that struck Khamenei's compound that night were the culmination of years of intelligence gathering, satellite surveillance, and careful planning by forces that had finally decided the time had come. Reports remain unclear about exactly who carried out the strike. Israel has not officially confirmed involvement, though intelligence sources suggest it was a joint operation involving Israeli intelligence and potentially coordination with opposition groups inside Iran who provided targeting information. What is clear is that the strike was remarkably precise. Khamenei's compound was destroyed. Khamenei was killed, but surrounding buildings suffered minimal damage, suggesting that whoever planned the operation wanted to kill Khamenei specifically, not to cause mass casualties among Tehran residents. Within hours of Khamenei's death, Iranian state media went into crisis mode. They broadcast old footage and replayed archived sermons while regime officials scrambled to figure out what to do next. By morning, President Masoud Pezeshkian appeared on television to confirm Khamenei's death and to promise that the regime would continue. But his voice shook, and within hours, protests erupted across Iran. In Tehran, people poured into the streets, not to mourn, but to celebrate. They danced. They lit fireworks. They tore down posters of Khamenei that had hung in public squares for decades. Videos showed women removing their hijabs and waving them in the air. People chanted the dictator is dead. Similar scenes played out in cities across Iran: Shiraz, Isfahan, Mashhad, Tabriz. The celebrations were spontaneous, joyful, and defiant. Not everyone celebrated. Some regime loyalists. In the days following Revolutionary Guards secured obituaries appeared in newspapers around threatened protesters. Many treated state him media as a broadcast messages demanding discussing his role, warning that enemies were trying to take advantage his relationship with the United States. But for millions of Iranians who had suffered under Khamenei's rule, these obituaries for the families of the disappeared. For the survivors of Evin Prison, not a political for the mothers who had buried their children. He was the head of a criminal enterprise that had hijacked a nation and held it hostage for nearly 4 decades. The nightmare was over. Consider the evidence. Murder. Khamenei bears direct responsibility for tens of thousands of deaths: the 1988 massacre, the 2009 crackdown, the 2019 killings, the 2022 protests, the prisoners tortured to death in Evin, the dissidents assassinated abroad. Each death occurred because Khamenei gave orders, issued fatwas, or created the system that made such violence possible. Torture. Under Khamenei's watch, thousands of Iranians were systematically tortured in prisons across the country. He appointed the judges who ordered the torture. He controlled the prison system. He was briefed on what was happening, and he allowed it to continue. Theft. Khamenei accumulated a personal fortune estimated at up to $200 billion while ordinary Iranians struggled with poverty and unemployment. He built this fortune by stealing from his own people, confiscating assets and property through a corrupt system he controlled. Terrorism. Khamenei funded, armed, and directed terrorist organizations and proxy militias across the Middle East, contributing to conflicts that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. If any individual not protected by the shield of state power had committed even a fraction of these crimes, they will be prosecuted as a serial killer, a terrorist, and a crime boss. But because Khamenei held the title of supreme leader, because he wrapped his crimes in religious authority, because he controlled the apparatus of the state, he operated with impunity for 40 years. Until he didn't. The death of Ali Khamenei is, in a sense, the closing of a 40-year cold case, a case where everyone knew who the perpetrator was, where the evidence was overwhelming, but where justice seemed impossible because the criminal controlled the courts. But history has a way of delivering verdicts that courts cannot. Khamenei died without ever facing trial for his crimes. He died without ever being held accountable by an international tribunal. He died surrounded by luxury and power rather than in a prison cell where he belonged. But he died knowing that his people despised him. He died knowing that his legacy would be defined not by the religious authority he claimed, but by the oceans of blood he spilled. He died knowing that history would remember him not as a leader, but as a monster. And that may be the only justice available in a world where dictators often die in their beds rather than in courtrooms. As of this writing, Iran's future remains uncertain. The regime Khamenei built still exists. The Revolutionary Guards, the judiciary, the intelligence services, the repressive apparatus. His death does not automatically mean freedom for the Iranian people. A power struggle is underway to determine who will succeed him as supreme leader. Some within the regime want to maintain the status quo. Others see an opportunity for limited reforms. And millions of Iranians are demanding an end to the entire system of clerical rule. What is clear is that Khamenei's death has opened a door, a chance for change that didn't exist while he was alive. Whether the Iranian people can walk through that door and build the free society they deserve remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, the monster is dead. And the nightmare he created for 40 years has finally ended. There's a quote often attributed to Edmund Burke: "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." For 40 years, the international community did largely nothing while Ali Khamenei brutalized his own people. Governments issued statements of concern. Human rights organizations documented abuses. But Khamenei remained in power, protected by geopolitics, by nuclear ambitions, by oil revenues, and by the simple fact that removing him would have required war. So he remained, and people suffered, and died, and disappeared into Evin Prison, and were buried in unmarked graves. This is the uncomfortable truth about monsters like Ali Khamenei. They don't exist in isolation. They exist because systems allow them to exist. They thrive because good people, people who know what is happening, decide that the cost of stopping them is too high. Every time a protester was shot in the streets of Tehran and the world issued a statement of concern but took no action, Khamenei learned that he could get away with it. Every time evidence emerged of torture in Evin Prison and no international sanctions followed, Khamenei learned that words without consequences meant nothing. Every time he funded terrorist groups and attacked dissidents abroad and faced no real retaliation, Khamenei learned that the international community's red lines were written in pencil. He was a monster, but we all knew it. And for 40 years, we'll let him remain in power. Perhaps his death will serve as a reminder. Evil unchecked does not simply disappear. It grows. It metastasizes. It creates decades of suffering. And when justice finally comes, whether from a missile in the night or from the inevitable judgment of history, it always comes too late for the victims. Ali Khamenei is dead, but the families who will never see their loved ones again, they carry on. The survivors of Evin Prison who wake up with nightmares, they carry on. The Iranian people who lived 4 decades under his boot, they carry on. This is not a story with a happy ending. It's a story where the monster died but can never undo the horror he created. It's a story where justice arrived 40 years late. But it's also a story of resilience, of a people who, despite everything, never stopped fighting, never stopped demanding freedom, never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the nightmare would end. And on March 1st, 2026, it finally did. May the monster rest in the judgment he avoided in life. and may his victims finally find peace.